The day I lost my hair, my mother was on a cruise. She had known about my diagnosis for 11 days before she booked that trip. My father knew too, and he said nothing, packed her bags, and drove her to the airport himself. I remember sitting in the oncology ward with my IV line in my arm and my phone in my lap, waiting for a message that never came. Not a call, not even a text asking if I had eaten. The chair beside me was empty every single time. I had been the daughter who showed up for every funeral, every surgery, every school play, every family crisis for 31 years. And when my body turned against me and I needed someone to sit in that chair, the people I had spent my whole life showing up for were somewhere warm, ordering cocktails, and taking photos for their social media pages. Before this story goes any further, I want to ask you something honestly. Think about the person in your life you would drop everything for without a second thought. Now ask yourself whether they would do the same for you. Hold that thought, because what Emily discovered about the people she loved most is going to stay with you long after this video ends. If you have ever been the one who always shows up, this story is for you. I'll create your complete YouTube script package now. This will be a long, detailed output. Please give it a moment to generate fully. A main title. My parents abandoned me during cancer treatment. My 4-word response left Dad speechless. B backup title 1. They disappeared when I got sick, then showed up wanting everything I built without them. C backup title 2. My family vanished during my worst year. The day I said 4 words changed everything. D backup title 3. I fought cancer alone while my parents took vacations. What I did when they came back broke them. E thumbnail text. You're not welcome here. F hook paragraph. The day I lost my hair, my mother was on a cruise. She had known about my diagnosis for 11 days before she booked that trip. My father knew too, and he said nothing, packed her bags, and drove her to the airport himself. I remember sitting in the oncology ward with my IV line in my arm and my phone in my lap, waiting for a message that never came. Not a call, not even a text asking if I had eaten. The chair beside me was empty every single time. I had been the daughter who showed up for every funeral, every surgery, every school play, every family crisis for 31 years. And when my body turned against me and I needed someone to sit in that chair, the people I had spent my whole life showing up for were somewhere warm, ordering cocktails, and taking photos for their social media pages. G unique CTA paragraph after hook. Before this story goes any further, I want to ask you something honestly. Think about the person in your life you would drop everything for without a second thought. Now ask yourself whether they would do the same for you. Hold that thought, because what Emily discovered about the people she loved most is going to stay with you long after this video ends. If you have ever been the one who always shows up, this story is for you. Age full script. My name is Emily, and I want to start by telling you something that took me a long time to say out loud. I was not always this clear. I was not always this calm. There was a version of me that would have softened this story, found excuses for the people in it, and ended the whole thing by saying I understood where they were coming from. That version of me spent 31 years being the most understanding person in every room. She is gone now. What replaced her is someone who finally chose herself, not because she stopped loving her family, but because she finally understood that love given without any care coming back is not a relationship. It is a habit someone else benefits from. I grew up in a mid-sized town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knows your last name and your grandmother's maiden name and what your father does for a living. My parents, Richard and Carol, were not cruel people in the obvious ways. They did not scream or hit or leave. What they did was subtler and, I think, much harder to name when you are living inside it. They had a favorite, and it was not me. My brother Daniel was 3 years older than me and the kind of person who filled a room without trying. He was funny and loud and charming, and my parents lit up around him in a way they never quite managed with me. I was the quiet one, the responsible one, the one who remembered to call on birthdays and return borrowed things, and make sure the pantry was stocked before Mom's bridge club came over. I was useful in the way furniture is useful. Present, reliable, and easy to ignore until something needs to be moved. I want to be fair here, because fairness matters to me even when the people I am being fair to do not deserve it. My parents were not monsters. They came to my school events. They paid for my college, partially, Daniel's tuition was fully covered, while I took out loans for the remaining 2 years of mine. They said I love you at the end of phone calls. But there is a difference between performing love and actually practicing it, and I learned that difference the hard way. Growing up, I watched my parents reorganize the family calendar around Daniel's needs. His football games, his college visits, his job interviews, his apartment moves, his girlfriend drama. My achievements happened in the background. When I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in health administration, my parents came to the ceremony, left early because Daniel had a work thing he needed a ride to, and took me to dinner 3 weeks later when the schedules lined up. When I got my first real job managing billing operations for a regional hospital network, my mother's response on the phone was, "Oh good, that sounds steady." When Daniel got a middle management position at a car dealership, my father hosted a backyard barbecue. I told myself this was just how families worked. Some people are louder and the noise gets attention. I was not a loud person. I made peace with it, or I thought I did. By the time I was 28, I had built a life I was genuinely proud of. I had worked my way up to a director-level role in hospital administration, managing a team of 14 people and overseeing a budget that would have made my father's eyes go wide if he had ever asked about it. I had bought a small house. I had good friends. I had savings. I was healthy, or I thought I was. Then I found the lump. It was a Tuesday in March, and I was in the shower getting ready for an early meeting, and my fingers found something that did not belong. I stood there for a long moment with the water running, and something in my body already knew before my mind had caught up. I called my doctor that afternoon and had an appointment 2 days later. The biopsy came back in 8 days, and the word that came with it was the word I had been quietly dreading since that Tuesday morning. Breast cancer, stage 2. Treatable, the oncologist said carefully but significant, we would need to move quickly. Surgery, followed by chemotherapy, followed by radiation. A treatment timeline of approximately 9 to 12 months. I sat in that office chair and nodded like someone who had just been given a complicated project at work. I took notes. I asked good questions. I held myself together until I reached my car in the parking garage, and then I put my forehead on the steering wheel and cried in a way I had not cried since I was a child. I called my parents that evening. I had rehearsed the words in the car on the drive home, not because I was afraid of them, but because I wanted to be calm. I did not want to panic them. I did not want to be dramatic. I told my father first because he answered. I said, "Dad, I got some news today and I need you to know. I have been diagnosed with breast cancer. It is stage 2 and we are starting treatment soon." There was a pause that lasted several seconds. Then my father said, "Oh, Emily, are you sure? Did they say it was definitely cancer?" I told him yes, I was sure, the biopsy had confirmed it. He said he was sorry to hear that. He said he would tell my mother. He asked if I needed anything right now. I said I did not know yet, I was still processing. He said okay, and the call ended. My mother called back 20 minutes later. She was softer on the phone than my father, and she asked more questions, practical ones about the treatment plan and the doctors and whether my insurance would cover everything. She said all the right things in the right order. She said she loved me. She said we would get through this. At the end of the call, she said, "Keep us updated, sweetheart." And I thought for a moment that maybe things would be different this time. Maybe a diagnosis like this would be the thing that made them see me clearly. I kept them updated. Every week I sent a message in the family group chat, not dramatic updates, just clear ones. Surgery scheduled. Surgery went well. Starting chemo next week. First round done, feeling rough but okay. I kept the messages calm because I did not want to perform my suffering for anyone. I just wanted them to know what was happening. Daniel responded to most of my messages with a thumbs up or a short, "Hang in there, M." My mother would occasionally reply with a heart emoji or a brief, "Thinking of you." My father responded to about 1 out of every 4 messages. No one visited. I want you to really sit with that. I was going through chemotherapy. I was alone in my house, losing my hair, losing weight, too exhausted some days to walk from my bedroom to my kitchen. My friends from work rotated through, dropping off food, sitting with me, driving me to appointments when I could not drive myself. My neighbor Patricia, a 67-year-old retired librarian who barely knew me before I got sick, started Lee Ving soup on my porch twice a week with little handwritten notes. She sat with me through my second infusion because I mentioned offhandedly that the ward felt very quiet. My friends were present in ways that still make me emotional to think about. My parents were in Florida. They had a winter rental there, something they had started doing a few years earlier when my father retired, and they stayed from January through April. I was diagnosed in March. They knew by the end of that first phone call in March, and they stayed in Florida. I told myself it was complicated. My mother had her own health issues, mild ones, but real. My father was not good in medical settings. The drive from Florida was long. The flights were expensive. I told myself every story I could find to avoid the plain truth of what was happening. They knew I was sick. They chose not to come. My surgery was scheduled for the second week of April. I asked, carefully and specifically, whether either of them could be there. Not to stay long, not to manage anything, just to be there when I woke up. I asked my mother directly on a phone call 10 days before the date. I told her the time and the hospital and that I would be under general anesthesia for approximately 3 hours. I said I would really love to have someone there when I came out of recovery. My mother said she would try to arrange something. She would talk to my father. The drive was long. My father's knee was bothering him from sitting in the car too much. The flights were hard to find last minute. She was not saying no, she just needed to check some things. She called me back 4 days before my surgery. They had looked at flights, she said, and the timing was just very difficult. They would come up in May once I was more stable and past the hard part. She said the surgeon would be there, and my friends would be there, and I was strong and capable, and everything was going to be fine. She said she would light a candle at church for me. I held the phone for a moment after she finished. Then I said okay. I said I understood. I said I would keep them posted. And I hung up, sat down on my kitchen floor, and stared at the wall for a long time. I went into surgery with my friend Jasmine holding my hand until the doors closed. Jasmine, who had a job and 2 kids and a 40-minute commute, had taken the day off to sit in a waiting room for 4 hours, so I would not be alone. I thought about that while the anesthesia was pulling me under, the specific mathematics of who chooses to show up and who chooses not to. I recovered. The surgery went well. The surgeon used that word, clean margins, which in oncology means something close to relief. I messaged the family group chat from my hospital bed the next morning. Surgery successful. Resting. The response from my mother was a praying hands emoji. My father did not respond for 2 days, and when he did, he wrote, "Good news. Rest up." Daniel sent a longer message that time, 3 full sentences about how proud he was of me and how strong I was. I remember reading it and feeling something complicated, because Daniel's absence was also its own kind of answer. But at least he had written sentences. Chemo was the hard part. I had known it would be hard. I had read everything I could find and spoken to my oncologist extensively, and felt as prepared as a person can feel for something that is, in every practical sense, unprepared forable. By the 3rd round, I had lost most of my hair. By the 4th, I was spending days in bed that felt like weeks. I had a notebook on my nightstand where I wrote down things I was grateful for, not because I am naturally optimistic, but because I needed something to hold onto. Patricia's soup was on that list almost every week. Jasmine's playlist she made for my infusion days, the view from my bedroom window, which faced a line of old maple trees that were just starting to bud by late April. My parents came in May, as promised. They drove up from Florida when their rental period ended and stopped at my house for 2 days on the way back to Ohio. My mother brought a casserole. My father brought a get-well card that he had signed in careful block letters. They sat in my living room and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as carefully managed concern, the kind of look people give you when they want to appear present without letting themselves be too affected. My mother said I look thin. She said it with worry in her voice, real worry, and for a moment I felt a surge of something like hope, that pull toward the parent you needed that never quite goes away no matter how old you get. My father asked about the doctors and the treatment timeline in a way that sounded more like a project debrief than a conversation. He nodded a lot. He said it sounded like I had things well in hand. He said the house looked good. He said he was proud of me. I wanted to say something true. I wanted to say, "Where were you in April?" I wanted to ask why the candle at church was a substitute for being in the room. I did not say any of it. I served them tea and answered their questions and made sure they were comfortable and sent them home with the leftover casserole, because my appetite was still unpredictable. I was so practiced at making people comfortable that I did it even when I was in the middle of chemotherapy, even when those people were the ones who had not shown up. The 2-day visit ended on a Sunday afternoon. My mother hugged me at the door and held on a little longer than usual, long enough that I thought maybe she felt the weight of what she had missed. My father patted my shoulder and said to call if I needed anything. They drove away and I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the car disappear around the corner, and something shifted inside me. Something very quiet, like a door swinging shut. I finished chemo in late July. I started radiation in August. By October, I was through the hardest part of treatment and beginning the slow work of rebuilding my energy, my appetite, my hair, my sense of what normal felt like. My oncologist said my scans looked good. She used the word encouraging. I sat in her office and felt a very complicated kind of joy. The joy of someone who had survived something enormous and was only now starting to understand how alone they had been inside it. I had spent 7 months in treatment, and my parents had visited for 2 days. In those 7 months, my father had called me 11 times. I know because I had, at some point around month 4, started keeping a log in my notebook. Not to be bitter, just to be accurate. 11 calls in 7 months, most of them brief, most of them following up on something I had texted rather than initiated by him. My mother had called more, maybe 30 times. But most of those calls were short and followed a pattern where she told me about things happening in their life, and then asked 1 or 2 questions about mine, and then said she had to go because something else needed her attention. Daniel had visited once, for a weekend in June, and I was genuinely glad for it. He was good company when he was present, and he helped me with some things around the house that I had been too tired to manage. But he also spent a significant portion of that weekend on his phone, and when he left on Sunday evening, he told me to take care of myself in a way that already sounded like a closing line. He did not come back. By the time I got my final clearance in the early winter, the world around me looked different. I had had many months of quiet, of reduced workload, of time alone in a way I had never really experienced as an adult. I had spent a lot of that time thinking about patterns, about what I had given and what I had received, about the image I had of my family and how far it was from the reality I had just lived through, about what I wanted the next chapter of my life to look like, and more importantly, who I wanted in it. I went back to work in a limited capacity in November and full capacity by January. My team was generous and warm about my return. My director had kept my position, which was not guaranteed and which I was genuinely grateful for. My first week back, one of my junior analysts brought in a cake that said "Welcome back, boss" in pink frosting. I stood in the conference room surrounded by people who had sent me cards and food and voice messages for months, and I felt something I want to try to describe accurately. It was not happiness exactly. It was more like recognition. These were the people who had acted like family, not by blood, by choice. I settled back into my life carefully. I had follow-up appointments every few months and a new relationship with my own body that involved paying attention to it in ways I had not before. I had a therapist, a practical and direct woman named Dr. Osei, who had helped me survive the emotional side of the treatment year, and who continued to help me now as I tried to process what I had learned about my family and what I wanted to do with that knowledge. Dr. Ose never told me what to feel. She asked questions and let me find the answers. One afternoon in February, about 3 months after I had finished treatment, she asked me what my relationship with my parents felt like now. I thought about it for a while before I answered. Then I said it felt like standing in front of a door I had been knocking on my whole life. I had spent 31 years knocking. And during the worst year of my life, I had finally accepted that no one was going to open it. She asked me what I thought that meant for how I moved forward. I said I did not know yet. She said that was honest, and that was enough for now. What happened next was not something I planned. I want to be clear about that, because what followed could look from the outside like a calculated move, like I had been building toward it deliberately. I had not. I was simply living my life, making my choices, moving forward. The consequences that came were consequences of truth, not revenge. I want you to understand that difference. In the spring after my treatment ended, I made several decisions that were genuinely for myself. First, I bought a larger house. I had been saving carefully for years, and my medical bills were significant, but I had also had supplemental insurance that covered more than I expected, and the year of reduced spending while I was in treatment had left my savings in better shape than I anticipated. I found a house in a neighborhood I loved, with the maple trees I had been dreaming about since I stared at the ones outside my bedroom window all those months. I bought it, and I moved in, and it felt like a declaration. Second, I began quietly restructuring my availability. I had always been the emergency contact, the first call, the daughter who sorted things out. I had covered for Daniel when he was between jobs and needed my parents not to worry. I had researched care options when my father's knee got worse and my mother needed guidance. I had organized, planned, called, reminded, followed up. I stepped back from all of that. Not dramatically, not with an announcement. I just stopped volunteering. When my mother called about something that could be handled by anyone, I listened but did not solve it for her. When my father mentioned something administrative that had always landed in my lap, I said he might want to call the relevant office directly. I was not cold. I was simply no longer available as a management service. Third, and this is the part that mattered most to me personally, I began spending my time and my energy on the people who had shown up. Jasmine and I started a standing Sunday dinner. Patricia and I had tea on Thursday mornings. I deepened friendships that had already proven themselves and let the performative ones thin out. My world got smaller and warmer and more honest. My family noticed the change before they understood it. My mother commented in late spring that I seemed harder to reach. I said I had been busy rebuilding. She said she was glad I was recovering well. I said I was doing more than recovering. In June, about 8 months after my treatment ended, my parents announced that they were thinking about selling the Ohio house and buying something smaller, possibly closer to Daniel, who had moved to a suburb outside Columbus. They wanted family input. They wanted to have a conversation about what made sense. My mother called me specifically to ask what I thought. I listened. I said the decision was theirs and I trusted them to make it. My mother seemed surprised by my neutrality. She said she had hoped for more input from me. I said I did not have strong feelings about where they lived. There was a pause, and then my mother said something that cracked the conversation open in a way she had not intended. She said, "Emily, you have seemed different lately. Is everything all right between us?" I was quiet for a moment. Then I said yes. I said everything was fine. I said I had gone through something very significant and it had given me a lot of clarity, and one of the things it had made clear to me was that I needed to stop carrying expectations that had not been earned. I kept my voice level. I was not unkind, but I was honest in a way I had not been before. My mother said she did not know what that meant. I said it meant I loved her and my father, but I was no longer going to manage the distance between us by pretending it was not there. The call ended shortly after. I could tell she was shaken. I felt something I did not expect, not guilt, not relief exactly, but a kind of stillness. Like something that had been vibrating inside me for years had finally gone quiet. My father called 2 days later. He was more direct than my mother in these conversations, which was both harder and in some ways easier. He said my mother was upset. He said she felt like I had been pulling away. He said he wanted to understand what was going on. I told him, not everything, not in an overwhelming rush, but I told him clearly that during my treatment year, I had needed my parents and they had not been there. I told him I had sat through appointments alone and recovered through infusion days alone and spent many nights in those months alone in a way that had taught me something I could not unlearn. I said it without blame in my voice because I genuinely did not want to punish anyone. I just wanted to be honest. My father was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We thought you had things handled." I want you to hold that sentence because it matters. We thought you had things handled. As if competence was a reason not to show up. As if being capable meant not needing anyone. As if the fact that I had not collapsed in a dramatic way gave them permission to stay comfortable and call it trust. I said I did have things handled, Dad. I handled them alone. Nay. And then I said 4 words that I had not planned. 4 words that came out of the steadiest, calmest, clearest part of me. I said, "That is my answer." He asked me what I meant. I said that what I had just told him, the truth about that year, the aloneness of it, the fact that I had kept the lights on and the appointments attended, and the treatment completed without a single family member in the room with me on the hardest days, that was my answer to any future conversation about what had changed between us. He wanted to understand why things felt different. That was why. I was not trying to punish him. I was just done pretending it had not happened. He said nothing for several seconds. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Quieter, a little broken at the edges. He said he was sorry. He said he had not thought about it that way. He said that was not an excuse, he knew that, but he wanted me to know he was sorry. I told him I heard him. I told him I appreciated that he said it. I told him that sorry was a beginning, not an ending, and that what happened next would matter more than the word. We got off the phone. I sat in my new kitchen, in my new house, with the maple trees just outside the window, and I thought about how long it had taken me to say something that true to someone I loved that much. The weeks that followed were complicated in the way that real life is always complicated, not cleanly resolved, not fully healed, but shifted. My parents had a lot of conversations, I think, that I was not part of. Daniel reached out to me in early July, not with the usual short message, but with a longer one. He said he had talked to our parents. He said he thought he understood now why I had seemed different. He said he was sorry too, that he had not done enough during my treatment year, and that he thought he had convinced himself you were handling it because he did not want to feel guilty about not coming more. I appreciated Daniel's honesty. It cost him something to write that, and I could tell. I replied warmly but honestly. I said I was glad he had said it. I said I missed the version of our relationship where we were actually close. I said I did not know how to rebuild something that had never quite been built right in the first place, but I was open to trying if he was willing to do the actual work of it. He said he wanted to try. I said okay. I meant it cautiously. What I did not know yet was that there was another layer to this story. There is almost always another layer, and I think that is true of most family situations that have been running on an unbalanced system for years. The imbalance has practical consequences, not just emotional ones, and eventually those consequences become impossible to ignore. My parents had assets, not enormous ones, but real ones. They had the Ohio house, which had appreciated significantly over 30 years. They had retirement accounts. They had a small investment portfolio my father had built carefully over a long career. They had always said, in the vague way parents sometimes say these things, that everything would be divided equally between Daniel and me when the time came. In August, about 10 months after my treatment ended, my mother had a health scare. It was not serious in the end, a cardiac event that resolved with medication and monitoring, but it frightened everyone, and it triggered conversations in my family that had been sitting unstarted for years. Specifically, it triggered conversations about estate planning, about what my parents wanted done with what they had, and about who they trusted to manage things if they needed managing. I found out indirectly, through a comment Daniel made in a group message, that my parents had been meeting with a financial advisor and a lawyer. I did not think much of it at the time. It was responsible. It was something they should have done years earlier. I was glad they were doing it. Then my mother called me in late September and asked if I could come to Ohio for a weekend in October. She said there were some things she wanted to talk about in person. I said I would come. The weekend was strange from the moment I arrived. My parents' Ohio house felt smaller than I remembered, or maybe I felt larger in it, which might be the same thing. My mother had made dinner and the table was set carefully, the good plates, which she only brought out for significant occasions. Daniel was not there. It was just the three of us. After dinner, my father brought out a folder. Inside was a document I was not entirely prepared for, though looking back, I should have seen it coming. It was an outline of a revised estate plan. The broad strokes were this. The house was going to be left to Daniel, specifically, because Daniel had expressed interest in eventually having a family home near them and he might want to live in it or manage it. The investment accounts would be split, but not equally. A larger portion was going toward Daniel as well, with the reasoning that he had less financial stability than I did and might need more support. There was a note in my mother's handwriting on the margin that said Emily is doing well. I read the document slowly. I did not react immediately. I have spent a long time learning to pause before I speak, and this was one of the moments where that habit served me well. When I put the folder down, my mother was watching me with a careful expression. My father was looking at his hands. I asked them to walk me through the reasoning. My mother said, gently, that they had thought about it very carefully. She said I had always been more independent and more financially stable. She said Daniel had struggled more and needed a foundation. She said they loved us both equally, but equal did not always mean identical. I listened to everything she said. Then I asked one question. I asked whether the fact that I had managed to be financially stable despite paying for parts of my cancer treatment largely alone, while also continuing to be the person who organized family logistics, managed problems, and showed up without being asked, had factored into their definition of who needed more support. She did not answer right away. My father cleared his throat. I said very calmly that I was not asking out of greed. I did not need their money. What I needed them to understand was that their plan was a conclusion drawn from a story they had not been paying close enough attention to. They had watched me handle things and concluded that I needed less. They had watched Daniel struggle and concluded that he needed more. What they had missed was the question of who had made it possible for me to handle things, and the answer to that question was no one. I had handled everything myself, including a year of cancer treatment in which I had been entirely alone. My father looked up from his hands. He said, "Emily." Just my name. Just that one word, and the way he said it had something in it I had not heard from him in years, something that recognized me as a person rather than a function. I said I was not asking them to change their plan tonight. I was asking them to think honestly about what story they had been telling themselves and whether it matched what had actually happened. Then I said something else. I said that I had spent a very long time being the dependable one, the one who handled things, the one who showed up. And I said that I wanted them to know that I had made a decision. I was no longer going to be available to manage family logistics, organize, plan, research, and sort things out in the background. Not because I was angry, but because the invisible labor I had always done had never been visible, and the consequence of it being invisible was that they had looked at my life and concluded I did not need anything. I was going to stop making that so easy to conclude. There was a long silence at the table, the kind that has weight. My mother had tears in her eyes. My father was very still. Then he said something I did not expect. He said, "You are right." Not as a negotiating move, not as a way to manage me. He said it quietly, with the sound of someone who had just recognized something they had been avoiding for a long time. I stayed the weekend. It was not a comfortable weekend, but it was an honest one. We had more conversations. My mother cried more than once. My father was quieter than I had ever seen him, a different kind of quiet than his usual distance, more like someone sitting with the weight of something they had just lifted up and looked at directly. By Sunday morning, something had shifted in the house. Not fixed, not resolved, but different. My mother made pancakes and we sat at the kitchen table, and she told me, without prompting, about the specific morning in April when I had been in surgery. She had been on the cruise. She said she had sat on the deck alone that morning while my father slept and looked at the water and thought about me, and then told herself I was fine because the alternative was too difficult to hold. She said she had known, even in that moment, that she was choosing comfort over truth. She said it out loud for the first time. She said she was sorry in a way that was different from all the previous sorries because it included the truth of the choice instead of just the regret of the outcome. I reached across the table and put my hand on hers. I did not say everything was okay because it was not entirely, and we both knew that. I said I heard her. I said that mattered. I said we were going to have to build something different from here, something more honest, and that I was willing to try if they were, but that I could not go back to the way things had been. She squeezed my hand and nodded. I drove home on Sunday afternoon and I cried most of the way. Not from sadness exactly. From the specific exhaustion of having been seen, finally, after a very long time. The estate plan was revised. My parents called me in November to tell me they had gone back to their attorney. The house would be sold when the time came and divided equally. The accounts would be split fairly, with modest additional support for Daniel structured as a separate agreed-upon gift rather than built into the base division. It was not a perfect solution, but it was an honest one, and that mattered more than the numbers. Daniel and I had several conversations in the months that followed. Some of them were hard. He admitted things about himself that I think cost him real pride to say, specifically that he had benefited from the family dynamics without fully examining them, that he had known I was the one carrying more of the invisible weight and had been glad it was not him. He said he was ashamed of that now. I told him shame was only useful if it changed behavior. He said he was trying to let it. I believed him cautiously. My relationship with my parents became something different from what it had been. It did not become perfect, because families do not become perfect, and I had learned to be skeptical of that word anyway. But it became more honest. My father started calling me just to talk, not to relay information or manage a situation, but to actually talk. It took some getting used to. The conversations were sometimes awkward in the way that conversations are awkward when two people are trying to learn a language they had never been taught. But they happened. He called on a Tuesday in February just to tell me he had been thinking about what I said, that having things handled was not the same as not needing anyone. He said it had been sitting with him for months. I said it had sat with me for much longer than that. My mother sent me something in the mail in March. It was a card, handwritten, several pages of her small, careful handwriting. She wrote about what she thought she had been doing during those years and what she understood now about the difference between trusting me and absenting herself from me. She wrote about the cruise, specifically, and the moment on the deck, and what she had chosen in that moment, and why she had been able to choose it. She did not make excuses. She offered explanations without asking for absolution. She said she wanted to learn how to be the mother she should have been, if I was willing to give her the space to try. I read that letter 3 times, then I put it in the drawer where I keep the things that matter. I want to tell you about the house, my new house with the maple trees, because it represents something I did not have words for when I bought it, but that I understand more clearly now. During treatment, on the hardest days, I would lie in bed and look at the trees outside my window and imagine a different version of my life. A version where there was more space and more light and more evidence of my own choices. Buying that house was not a reaction to my family. It was a direction toward myself. It was the first major decision I made entirely for me, without calculating how it would affect anyone else, without factoring in whether it would be convenient for family visits, without asking what anyone else thought about the timing, or the neighborhood, or the price. I have a garden now. Patricia helped me start it in the spring after I moved in, because she knows about gardens and I know very little, but I was willing to learn. I grow tomatoes and basil and a particular variety of lavender that is almost impossible to kill, which felt like the right place to start. I sit in that garden on Saturday mornings with my coffee, and I think about the version of me who used to reorganize her whole weekend around other people's needs. I miss her sometimes because she was kind, but I do not miss the weight she carried. This past summer, my whole family came to visit, my parents, Daniel and his girlfriend. It was the first time my parents had been to my new house, which had been deliberate on my part. I was not ready to have them there until things had shifted enough that the visit could be something real rather than a performance. When they arrived, my mother walked through the front door and looked around and said, quietly, "Oh, Emily, this is you." And I knew what she meant. She meant it looked like me, chosen by me, decorated by me, built by me around the things I actually loved. She said it with something on her face that I had not seen there in a long time. I think it was recognition. She was seeing me, maybe clearly for the first time. We had dinner in the garden. My father helped me carry chairs outside and he moved carefully, slowly, his knee still bothering him, and I watched him navigate the unfamiliar yard without his usual performance of being fine. He sat down with some difficulty and then looked up at the maple trees and said they were beautiful. I said I had chosen the house specifically for those trees. He looked at me for a moment and then he said, "I am glad you chose. Something you loved." There was a weight to it that we both understood. He was talking about more than the house. It was not a perfect day. My father and Daniel had a tension between them about something unrelated that surfaced briefly over dinner and had to be smoothed over. My mother hovered a little more than I needed. The day had the awkward warmth of people trying to rebuild something, which is its own kind of beauty if you can be patient enough to see it that way. What I know now is this: being dependable is not a personality trait. It is a choice, and like all choices, it should be made deliberately. I had spent years being dependable in ways that were invisible, in ways that had somehow become evidence that I did not need anything in return. I had been so good at handling things that no one around me developed the reflex to show up for me, and by the time I needed them to have that reflex, they had not built it. That is not an excuse for what they did during my treatment year. I want to be clear about that. The choice to not visit, to not fly, to not drive, to stay in Florida and send heart emojis while I went through surgery and chemo and radiation alone, that was a choice made by adults who understood what cancer treatment was. There is no version of that year where I forgive them for not trying harder to be there. But I can hold both truths at the same time. I can know that what they did was a real failure, and also know that the patterns that led to it were built over decades, partly by all of us, and that understanding those patterns is not the same as excusing the harm. What I did with my 4 words when I told my father that was my answer was refuse to let the harm be smoothed over. I refused to let the conversation move on without first sitting in the truth of what had happened. And that refusal, as simple and as quiet as it was the most powerful thing I had ever done in my relationship with my father, because it stopped a pattern that had run for 31 years. It stopped the pattern of Emily handles it. Emily is fine. Emily does not need much. It stopped it cold. The months after that have been about building something true, not perfect, true. I still have my follow-up appointments. My scans continue to be encouraging, and I am cautiously glad about that every single time. I still have my therapist, my garden, my Thursday mornings with Patricia, my Sunday dinners with Jasmine. I still work the job I love and manage the team that brought me a pink cake and said welcome back. My life, if you could see it from outside, would not look dramatic. It looks ordinary. It looks like a woman who went through something enormous and came out the other side, knowing exactly who she is and exactly who she wants around her. My father calls me every Tuesday now. Last Tuesday he called while I was in the garden, and I answered with dirt on my hands, and he asked me what I was doing, and I told him about the lavender, and he said he did not know I had a green thumb. I said I was still finding out what I had. He laughed, a real one, and the sound of it sat in the air for a moment in a way that felt like something. I still have the notebook from my treatment year. I read it sometimes when I want to remember who I was in that time, not to be sad about it, but to honor her. The woman who showed up for every appointment, who organized every form, who ate whatever she could manage and rested when she had to and kept the lights on alone. She deserved someone in the chair beside her. She got Patricia's soup instead, and Patricia's soup was given with more love than a lot of people's presents would have been. But she deserved better from the people who were supposed to be her family. She deserved that, and she knows it now. Emily knows it now. And knowing it has made all the difference. Before you go, I want to ask you something that Emily's story made me think about for a long time after writing it. How many times have you handled something enormous completely alone, not because there was no one to call, but because you had trained the people around you to believe you never needed anyone? If the answer is more times than you can count, then maybe Emily's story is not just a story. Maybe it is a mirror. Leave a comment and tell me, what would your 4 words have been?